Folks, welcome to the Prepared Homestead. This is Travis. Thank you all for stopping by to watch. I want to talk to you today about a boring, common, typical prepping subject that everyone is already an expert on, okay? The reason why I'm bringing this up, again, is because of the vital importance of it. I mean, there's not too much more important to survival than the food that you put in your mouth that keeps your body going. It is the fuel to keep your body functioning. And while as preppers, no matter how advanced you think you are, you should always be revisiting how much food you have in storage. It is important. And I'll tell you this, the reason why it's important isn't just because it's what you're going to need to keep your body functioning. It's not just because it's the fuel to keep you going. It's not just because you don't want to get hungry. I mean, no one wants to try to be in survival mode and your belly's empty. It's because people will kill you for it, and you may get to the point that you're willing, or at least considering, taking a life for food. And I say this not because I'm trying to be dramatic and scare people and, talk about some kind of hypothetical situation that most likely would never happen. I say this because we know it happens. It actually happens all the time. All over the world, it's not that uncommon for people to fight and to actually take a life over food. It happens actually quite often when governments fail and societies start to collapse, or when there's famines, which the United Nations and many other big organizations are predicting a famine this next year. Running out of food and then getting to the point that you would actually consider causing violence or even taking a life is actually more common than most people think. And we're privileged to live in a society that's just not typically the case. Typically, the only time you see people commit violent acts over food is because they're just a criminal element that has no care about anyone or has no value of life, and they would just commit a crime for no reasons. But in the world that we may be seeing in our future, near in our future, we may be seeing a time where people that you never thought possible would consider using violence just to get food or just to keep food. And so, as much as it seems like a very minor thing to talk about, or something that's very introductory when it comes to preparedness, food is extremely important. So I want to talk about that. This past week I spoke with someone. They're somewhat new to prepping. I mean, they've actually considered themselves a prepper for a long time, but they're one of the type, and I'm not putting anyone down that might consider themselves or fall into this category, but they're one of the types that, they know they need to do it. They have a little farm. They know it's a good idea because there could be a power outage or a storm, but they haven't really made it a priority in their life and taken it serious to understand that the world is drastically changing, and making sure that you have the things and the training and the skills and the community is really going to be necessary for your survival. Until recently, they're really starting to set into them. So anyways, we were having this conversation, and they have a fairly large family, husband and wife and several kids, and they were figuring out how much food that they need, and they were figuring out how much food to put back, and then they produce food, they grow food, they have a garden. And they said they realized this past year, and they have a large garden, I'm not sure of the exact size, but I do know that it's large. And they said that they realized this past year with their garden, as proud as they are of being able to produce so much food, it's just certainly not enough for them to live off of. In fact, as much food as they produce, whether it's through growing crops or raising meat animals, they've realized that they're just nowhere near the production level that they need to survive, to be sustainable. And then they look at their food preps, the stuff they have in storage, and they're starting to realize that while they thought they had a lot of food on hand, like just a bountiful amount of food, when they start to sit down and do the math, they realize they don't really have quite as much food as they thought. At least it's not going to last as long as they thought. And that's what gets a lot of people. We live in a world where most people don't keep a lot of food on hand. I know some of you are different, and many of you will tell a story about how your parents or your grandparents put lots of food, had big root cellars with lots of food, and that's all true for many of us. But the fact is that most modern people really don't have the concept in their mind of what the amount of food that it takes to feed a family for 1 year. And so when you start stocking up and you get to that moment that you're proud of yourself and you're like, man, I've really accomplished something. I've got a whole bunch of food. You kind of get let down a little bit when you start sitting there and you're doing the math and you realize, wow, this isn't quite as much as I thought. This is only maybe 3 or 4 months or 5 or 6 months. I thought I had over a year's worth of food, because it takes a lot to keep a family going. There's many ways of doing this, and I wasn't going to focus in specifically on the ways of figuring out how much food, but one of the ways is just simply figuring out how many calories a person needs, and that's already done for you. 2,000 average for an adult, 2,200, 2,000. I always go with 2,000 because it's just easy, big round number to figure. And if you figure 2,000 calories per day per person, you can figure out how many calories you need for the whole year. And then you can break that down with a little bit of math and figure out how many calories you have on hand. That's one way of doing it. Another way, it's even simpler than that, is just by weight. Most people, and if you look around, because I've done this a few times, a lot of websites, I'll see anywhere from 300 pounds per person, 400 pounds per person, 500 pounds per person. My opinion is that's probably not enough. You're probably looking at 600 to 700 pounds per person of food for 1 year. That's just how it is, and you're going to get a little extra there most likely, and it's depending on how you do it and what you're putting back. Calories is key, but yet you also want to maintain nutrition, and then you also have to figure. I just said 2,000 calories a day. That's based on the average activity of an American right now. If you're in survival mode and you're out there working every day outside, you're working, maybe you don't have a lot of air conditioning or maybe none at all, you're doing more walking, more strenuous activity, the odds are you're going to need more than 2,000 calories to keep you going. So I would certainly always plan on extra. When you do that and you figure out whether you're going by weight or calories or some other method, it doesn't take too long to figure out that you don't have enough, or at least it's not where you want to be. And so mostly my message today is no matter how advanced you think you are, because here's what I find that seems to be typical. People start off with prepping their foods. That's where they get into prepping first. So they're putting food back. When they start to get, a little bit on hand, then they start adding in some other things that they prepare. Maybe it's medical supplies, bandages and, triple antibiotic appointment, over-the-counter medications, things like that. Along the way, they're probably stocking up on some storing up water. Maybe you've purchased a good water filter. And then typically they go into, well, I need something to protect this because, like I just said, people will kill you over your food at some point. And so I gotta make sure I have that. And then it just keeps going and going. And what happens, I find, is a lot of people get to a point that they're comfortable with what they have in their food preps. They think they've got it down pretty good. And so they slack off of the food that they have on hand, or at least prepping that food, and they start focusing on other areas. And while it's certainly not wrong to focus on other areas, don't forget your food. A lot of us, or at least the way I advise doing it, is that the bulk of your food preps are things that you're eating and using all the time. At least a 1 year food supply should be a goal of food that you're using already. So if you just took your pantry right now, if you're not a prepper and you don't have any food stocked up long term, if you went into your kitchen or your pantry or both and you figured out what do you keep on hand just to cook just to make meals. This is the stuff that you have on hand, the soups and the seasonings and the pastas and that kind of stuff that you have on hand. The vast majority of that food will last at least a year on the shelf, at least. So I would advise your pantry, your kitchen pantry that you cook out of and that you make your meals should have at least a 1-year food supply. That's actually not too hard to figure. It may take you a few weeks or a month or two to get an exact amount of what you need, but if at the end of the month you've gone through 6 cans of soup for 1 month, then it's 6 times 12, and there you go. That's how many cans of that soup that you need to have on hand. And you can do this with all items. And so that's what you're working out of. That second year of food can be a mixture of that and then more of the bulk items. And of course, as you're using out of it, you should be adding back to it and rotating your food. This is all really important so that you don't say, well, I've got a year food supply in my pantry, and then 6 months later you've used it all up, and like, well, now I only have a 6 month. I mean, I've saved money for the last 6 months. I haven't had to buy a lot of groceries, but now I only have 6 months food on hand. Don't do that. Make sure you're constantly replenishing it. But a lot of people, many times when they hit a certain level, I had someone email me a few weeks ago and said, is there at any point do you think it's the right time to stop prepping food, that you've probably got enough? Like, how much do you think a person would have to have on hand for it to be a point that you're like, okay, I'm not going to prep any more food? And I don't know that that's really a thing, if it's a possibility. I guess it is. I guess if you're, if you've been extremely diligent and you've put a lot of money into it and you have the space, because that's the other thing, it takes a lot of space to store 2 years of food. If you got to 5 or 10 years worth of food, it's probably time to start really backing down a little bit. But you want to keep replenishing as you're using. The big point is, though, is that so many people, especially the more advanced prepper that's been doing it a while, a lot of times they get focused on all of these other very important projects. Well, I want to put my my energy and my money and focus into creating this hydroelectric system, or some type of hand pump well system, or solar system, or running my car off of some type of biofuel that I've made, or all these other things that are kind of more advanced, and that's fine. But don't forget your food, because all the signs show us that this next year is going to be even worse when it comes to food. All of us have complained, I am sure. I can just almost guarantee that everyone watching this has complained at least some point in the last year over the cost of food, or maybe the availability of certain items that you are used to buying. So whatever you have experienced in the past year when it comes to food, next year's going to be worse. All the predictions, and I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the experts, are saying next year's going to be worse. The cost of food is going to go up at least another 5% overall. We're going to see, continued increase in prices and lessened availability in things like poultry and eggs. General meat like beef and stuff is probably going to get worse. Vegetable crops, grains are probably going to become more expensive. There's an expectation that fertilizer prices will increase even more next year. And then there's all these variables that's hard to figure in, of potential world wars with Russia and China, or just a dollar collapse, or a transition from the Federal Reserve note paper money over to a central bank digital currency. There's all of these major factors that could take place over the next 12 months. And so when you add those in, it's really hard to figure out how bad things are going to be with food. But there's really not much indication out there that things are going to get better, okay? That food's going to get cheaper, or that the availability is going to increase. Odds are it's going to continue to worsen. And it's very possible that some of those events that I spoke of, and maybe a few others, could cause us to really go off the edge and really truly experience that big SHTF that many of us are planning for. And we realize that the chances of that happening, the odds of it happening, are greatly increasing because of all the stuff going on. When that happens, food's going to be really bad, folks. I mean, again, people kill people over food. People fight and die just so that they can have another meal to keep them alive a little longer. Don't be foolish, and don't get to the point that you've kind of relaxed yourself when it comes to your food preps, thinking, well, I've done pretty good. I've got 6 months, a year worth of food. I can kind of slack off and do something else. You should be doing other things. You should be prepping in other areas. Maybe you're not spending, 100 or even 80% of your prepping funds on food, but you should always be doing something. Always be putting forth an effort and diversify it. Like I said, at least a year's worth of a working pantry, meaning that's food that you eat on a regular basis. Have some, maybe not all, but some food that is, long-term dried goods, your rice, your beans, your flours, your sugars, your other items like that, oats. It wouldn't hurt to have some emergency type food, freeze-dried food, things that are easy. And the reason is, some people disagree with me on that. The reason is that if there is an immediate emergency, and you really have to focus on just surviving, having that food that's very easy to eat and produce, and you don't have to cook and figure out what you're going to do for meals because you're very stressed and you're focused on some event that's happened, makes things easier. It makes things easier to say, well, at least we don't have to worry about food and preparing it and eating it and what to eat and how to prepare it and how to cook and the cleanup. We just crack open a bag, dump some hot water on it, and we're good to go. That's the area that I think that freeze-dried is really good. And of course, some of you just have the money that you're like, you know what, I'm just gonna go the easy route and I'm gonna buy a year or two worth of freeze-dried food. But certainly diversify, and then also produce your own food. That is so critical, because those food preps, that year or two of food that you stocked away, all that is a transition. That's just something to give it like a Band-Aid to transition you to the point that you're producing your own food. Because if things collapse completely and kind of really the rug is really pulled out from under us, it could be years before the food supplies really stabilize. And so you want to be producing your own food, and most people can't really stock up several years worth of food. So get to where you're producing food. And I'm telling you folks, this is why I tell people all the time, this is like the 3rd year in a row now, maybe 4th year, I have told people that you really, really need to be producing as much food as you can this year. And it may not just be because that's what you need to survive. It's probably going to be because you're learning how to do it. We have a huge garden, almost 10,000 square foot garden. And it's still, I don't feel confident enough that garden is going to be what we survive out of, that it produces enough. So every year we're expanding, and this year's no different. We're expanding every year, increasing the amount of food that we're growing, getting a little bit better at it. And that's what's necessary, because it takes a whole lot more than what you realize to produce enough food for a family. So while you're doing your preparations, while you're figuring out what you need to do, what next project, what next skill that you're developing, don't forget food. Food is important. It's very important. It's one of those basic foundational things that's going to keep you and your family alive. And so don't think that you've advanced so far that you don't have to focus on food. Certainly keep doing it. Keep stocking up. Keep adding to those food supplies. Make sure they're rotated, but keep at it, folks, because now is the time to get your houses in order. It's the time to get yourselves prepared mentally, physically, and spiritually. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.